everyone. Thanks for being here. It's a privilege to be on the stage, especially with James and Rudy. And I'm convinced that you'll end the session with more insight as to what's going on in South Africa and what are the prospects. It's a seriously big screen, hey? It's like you end up being huge. All right, so if you've been watching the media recently, right, you would have seen South Africa's GDP performance for the fourth quarter of the year, last year, 0.1%. Exciting, thrilling 0.1% growth. And so for last year, if you take it in its entirety, we grew this country by 0.6%. That's dismal. That's hopeless. That's nowhere near enough to meet the needs of the population and to make a difference in people's lives. The population in South Africa grows at 1.6% a year, so we've got to get GDP up to at least 1.6, right? And realistically, 1.6 is also not going to make much of a difference, so you've got to lift the growth rate beyond that. And if we want to create jobs, if we want to create some wealth, we want to create better lives for individuals, then we've got to target 3-4% GDP growth on a sustained basis. The problem is very obvious. If we want to take South Africa's growth rate from 0.6% to 3%, there's some very clear obstacles in our way. And a lot of those obstacles relate to infrastructure bottlenecks. And without removing those infrastructure bottlenecks, we're going to struggle to lift the growth rate. We're going to struggle to attract broad private sector investment. We're going to struggle to lift confidence. So that, I think, is many countries have experienced that. That's fairly obvious. What isn't perhaps that obvious, although it's become more obvious in recent years, is that government has run out of money. Now, I think government knows that, more or less. And at the same time, the SOEs have run out of money, right? Their balance sheets are not strong. They're looking constantly for government, for financial assistance. And so we end up with a problem that says to us, we need infrastructure desperately, but who the hell is going to fund it? Who the hell is going to do it? And if we can't breach that gap, how are we going to grow this economy? So the challenge for South Africa, I think, is very obvious, very evident. And we need to find a solution. Now, fortunately, thank goodness, there is a solution. And that solution is simply to involve the private sector more in the development of South Africa's infrastructure. In my mind, government recognizes that. And that's why we've got Rudy Dix from the Office of the Presidency on the stage. He's the head of project management. In essence, he's the head of structural reform in South Africa. And we want to find out from Rudy what's happening to this idea, what's happening to structural reform. Are we seeing government open the door to allow private sector in, and are we likely to see more of that? At the same time, we've got James Holly from Traction. If you're not aware of what Traction is the biggest railway operator, private sector railway operator on the African continent. Although obviously in South Africa they don't operate many railway systems simply because of the structure of Transnet and the railway industry. But James is very keen to invest in South African railway, and so he understands a huge amount about railway systems, what it takes, what that investment would look like, what's required. And when we spoke to James last week in Cape Town, he said there is a railway boom coming. And we want to explore that idea. Are we facing a railway boom? Now, in Cape Town, when you say something's booming, they kind of yawn. They're not too excited about that because most things seem to be booming, and so you have to make a bigger impression. But in Johannesburg, if you don't have water and you talk about a railway boom, then it's quite thrilling. So it's a different environment, and I'm hoping that resonates more with Johannesburg residents. Okay, so that's a long introduction, I think. So to kick things off, we're going to ask Rudy, from your perspective, Rudy, the focus in the President's office initially and understandably was energy sector reform. And I think that that's gone well. I think the private sector's responded. I think the energy, the electricity minister is doing a good job. I think we definitely have less load shedding, and we have the prospect of less load shedding going forward. So I'm encouraged by that progress, but at the same time, it's very evident that we also have obstacles in terms of port and rail capacity. So won't you give us an idea of where your focus is? You focused on many projects, there are many areas of reform, but what is consuming most of your attention?
Precisely those two areas, Kevin. I mean, the structural reform program, when it started in October 2020, is focused on 5 key areas: energy supply, ports and rail efficiencies, visa, bulk water systems, and dealing with water and water insecurity, and lastly, ICT, the auctioning of spectrum and stuff like that. So a lot of the 3 areas have been dealt with, particularly the significance around ICT reform, auctioning, of course. 12 years of trying to decide how we're going to sell off our scarce spectrum, the shift from analog to digital, for example. The biggest constraint, I mean, in your introduction, you're quite spot on. The biggest constraint for growth remains energy, and it remains certainly logistics and the crisis in logistics in moving our goods from pit to port, so to speak, right? And that's really been the major focus. And so, of course, as you indicated, for us it's going to be important. We've run a course of the way we've done and run SOEs, particularly Eskom, the same for Transnet. And certainly the kind of evolution in both energy and logistics is evolving towards greater private sector participation in operations, for sure. So what has been fundamental for us, both in energy and in rail, it's very a similar approach. We, for example, have set up in energy, let's use energy first, we've set up a national transmission company. We did a couple of tweaks with the legislation. I've just seen yesterday that the Portfolio Committee has adopted the Electricity Regulatory Act, which institutionalizes the reform around creating a competitive energy space for generation, breaks up the single buyer model, breaks up the vertically integrated model, and I think that's quite important. It entrenches the fact that private sector participation will be enhanced and will compete on a competitive market with the national transmission company purchasing. Again, transmission remains with the state. Now, we've done very similar reforms for logistics and not as far ahead as we are in energy, but certainly the same thing. What are the 2 fundamental things that we want to see happening over there? Again, efficiency and greater competition in the operations, both on rail and port. What do we need to do? Separate operations and infrastructure, formally create the operationalization of the Transnet National Port Authority, and of course, we're in the midst of the separation between operations and infrastructure in rail. That's never happened. So setting up an infrastructure manager, that would initially be in Transnet as an operating division and become a full subsidiary. These are important steps in the direction where we are going to have to ensure greater participation of the private sector. So the bigger focus for us in the last 2 years has been those 2 sectors. It will continue to be those 2 sectors in the next 2 years. At least, as you say, energy, we know that, more or less know where we're at. We know that we are going to see reduced stages of load shedding, eventually ending load shedding, creating a competitive market space, but also ensuring that we get, much more private sector investment, household rooftops. And those are important signals and regulatory and institutional reform that we'll have to continue to do. We're at the beginning stages with rail and ports, and I think the most important point right now is getting open access, right, for the rail network. And that would be issued through a network statement, and as we've indicated, that should happen within the next few months, and that's quite important. And really a network statement is basically signaling to the private sector, this is the network that's there, this is open for business, this is the access charge, this is the state of the rail network, and here you are able to participate on, on the rail system going forward. And I think these are important reforms, but certainly, as you point out, we see private sector having greater participation in both energy and in the logistics space, particularly rail and ports.
Okay, so this network statement, let's say it comes out in April, that's essentially telling the private sector you're looking for investment from the private sector into the railway system, right? But you're not privatizing the railway. There's no discussion about the sale of state assets. Am I right? This is about getting the private sector to contract to operate portions of the railway system. Is that correct?
That's spot on, Kevin. And that will be done in various forms: concessioning, third-party access, private sector participations, strategic equity partnerships. But in the same way that we're doing the National Transmission Company, we basically the pylons and the cables, high voltage cables, remain ours. We'll also find different ways of private sector investing in the transmission and extending the transmission network, the target of 14,000 kilometers of new transmission cabling over the next 10 years. It's the same thing over here in rail. Basically, we have to take responsibility for the infrastructure. We have to maintain it. We have to ensure that it's in a state where the private sector can invest. And the network statement basically says this is the part of the network that is available to the private sector for you to invest and to run your locomotives on. And, it would mean basically signaling to the private sector that TFR would not be the only operator on the lines. We do have some branch access for private sector, but this is quite minute, and there's a lot of discriminatory access and discriminatory pricing. That's what we need to get rid of. And so on a competitive basis, allow the private sector to participate in different forms of the corridors that are there, and that's really what we want to do.
Okay. So we're going to have this network statement. It's going to brag about what the private sector can invest in terms of rail infrastructure. James, from your perspective, what do you want to see government offer you in order to entice you to say, okay, I'm going to invest in South African railway and I'm going to become a railway operator in South Africa? What do you want to see government offer you to do that?
So, Kevin, there are a number of elements that we need to see in order to be able to make the type of investments that are needed to really turbocharge our railways. If you think about what's at stake here, the Gain Institute at Stellenbosch did an analysis as to how much, what the economic cost was of not being able to move product by rail to the sea, and in 2022 it was 6% of GDP, and in 2023 it was 4.5% of GDP. And in the context of 16 million people employed, that's potentially 1 million jobs. We're talking about an enormous economic impact and the consequences of getting this right, okay? So in that context, what do we need to see the massive rollout of trains by the private sector? Transnet's volumes have gone from 226 million tons and 5 years ago down to 149 million tons this year. That's 77 million ton reduction, approximately a third, okay? And that gives you the sense of what's economically at stake. Now, you can broadly separate the South African rail system into two parts, okay? You've got the bulk rail sector and you've got the general freight rail sector. The bulk rail sector makes up about 15% of the total rail network, but it moves about 2/3 of the total volumes in South Africa. The general freight network, of course, is the bulk of our rail track, okay? Now, in the bulk sector, you've got a massive delta between the price between road and rail, okay? And what that means is that despite the fact that we've got a network that is in a poor condition today, and if you read all of the policy statements that have come out from government that have been approved by Cabinet, they all agree with me that the network is in bad condition. So that's not me standing here today that's saying it, it's also government that's saying the network is in poor condition today. What that means is that as a private operator, we have the ability there to price for an element of inefficiency in the network operations. And the delta between road and rail pricing in the bulk sector is huge. It's about 300%. So if you look at coal, circa 250 Rand a ton to get a ton of coal to Richards Bay, 750 to 1,000 Rand on a truck. Okay, so a huge delta. We can price for an element of inefficiency on that side. And that's brilliant. There's a rail boom coming because we can price into that, and it's a lot of tonnage, okay? But what we really need to see in South Africa, okay, is how do we unlock the other 85%? Because I think that's how we're going to change the trajectory of our economy into one of international competitiveness.
So that's the general freight component.
Yeah.
which is small in volume but massive in terms of the network.
Yes, and huge in terms of potential economic impact.
Sure.
Okay, because it serves the general economy of South Africa. And for that, we need to see government's concession process roll out at scale. Okay? The network statement's going to come out and it's going to deal with third-party access, it's going to deal with the length of access, it's going to deal with the price of access, it's going to deal with whether we have to join the Transnet Bargaining Council, which is a huge issue for us. It's going to deal with those issues. But how do we change rail in South Africa? The concessions have to roll out. We have to recapitalize the condition of our infrastructure so we can achieve efficiency in rail, because if rail is competing with road on price, we need enormous efficiency on rail. And elsewhere in the world, they have shown the way. On Black Friday, the Class 1 railroads in America moved approximately 35% of Amazon's product on Black Friday.
Wow.
Unbelievable. There's no reason why rail can't move general freight, and we should.
Okay. So back in 2022, there was a pilot initiative by government to get the private sector involved in development of railway. You were keen on participating back then in this private sector initiative, but then you pulled out. Why will it be different this time?
So at the time that the Phase 1 slot sales came out, we didn't like the terms and conditions, okay? But we, after a significant amount of navel-gazing, we eventually decided to go for it. And the reason we decided that was we felt that the creation of a precedent of a private train operating in South Africa for the first time in multiple generations was an extremely important precedent to create, to show that the sky is not going to fall, okay? When we got into the detailed negotiations, and it must be said that Transnet negotiated with us in good faith, on both sides of the table, we really wanted this pilot to run, okay? We were going to take a very profitable train out of Africa and bring it into what we hoped was going to be a break-even service between Kroonstad and East London, okay? And so it was a cost we could bear and we could work with. But when it came to the detailed terms and conditions of that, okay, it was a requirement that we had to join the Transnet Bargaining Council. That meant we had to reset all of the terms of employment of all of our sites across 8 countries in Africa, and that would have put our whole business under huge duress. And of course, for one pilot project in South Africa, that no longer was possible. In terms of why is it going to be different, the market did not react to the Phase 1 slot sales. There were 18 slots on sale. We went for 2. There was one other party, I don't know who they were that went for one other. We were only allocated 1 slot. We failed on a technical basis on the other slot because we didn't have electric locomotives, and they specified electric locomotives. This time, we're coming with, and I believe we'll see this in the network statement, long-dated access rights. And why do you need that in the rail sector? It's because our assets last for a very long time. On the specification sheet, when we buy our locomotives, it says life of asset 30 years. In order to be able to provide services to our customers at a rate that makes any sort of sense, we need to raise very long-term finance. In order to raise long-term finance, we need to have long-term contracting into the infrastructure for the rights to operate it on one side, and we need to have long-term...
What's a long-term contract?
10 years, 10 years, absolute minimum. If the network statement comes out with anything less than 10 years, it's going to be it's going to undermine investment significantly. And I believe the investment statement is coming out very shortly. The rumor mill says imminently.
We could ask the person who really knows.
And it's coming for public comment, so we're going to know and we'll comment and we'll complain.
It will soon come on for public comment, right? And I think that's quite important. We are still earmarking for it to be finalized by the 1st of April, as you've indicated earlier. But I mean, Jamie's right. I mean, we had the conversation and we assessed with Transnet, of course. It was Transnet's initiative to in a sense, do their first dabbling into a private sector participation within selling the slot sales, right? I mean, other than what Jamie says, I mean, one of the other factors which was quite important, and we raised this in the debate afterwards, in assessing why this thing had not been successful, was the fact that they were going to give slots for 2 years. Now, if you're in the rail sector like Jamie is, you would know that a train set would probably cost around 250 million. That's a loco with wagons, right? We have shortage of locos and wagons in South Africa, which means they either would have to order it, and it takes about 2 years for them to get it, or they would have to lease it, right? But there's a shortage. So literally a pop at 250 million if you want to do that, and you're not quite sure whether you'll get it beyond 2 years. That's not a good investment, and that's why I think the point that Jamie makes is spot on, that the signal has to be right, it has to be long-term access, it has to be, a proper, non-discriminatory access charge, and this is going to be quite important. There are a number of other factors. I also think that one of the challenges were that in setting up a situation where you're trying to get private sector participation, you're not doing some of the necessary prior work. And the prior work is to, for example, many of the stuff that we're doing now, Kevin, which is you have to have a network statement. You have to set the rules in a sense, right? So you didn't set the rules up front. You're also not quite clear how your pricing charges and access charges work. So it's very discriminatory. You don't have full disclosure. How does TFR or the infrastructure manager would do that? Now, it's quite important for them to be able to show those calculations. So tariff and tariff methodologies are important to understand how you get to a per rand or per cent per ton, right, on the network. And during the initial thing in 2022, none of that was available. So you're kind of having someone who is a referee and a player at the same time. And you expect the private sector to come in, and I think it was simply just, you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that you're not setting the ground rules quite well over here, neither are you providing the correct signal for private sector participation.
So lessons have been learned from the pilot study, and so we're confident that we'll be offering the private sector something that is interesting that they can start to invest. Rudy, does that investment depend on improving the ports at the same time?
It has to. I mean, it's fundamental, particularly for the bulk lines. There's a whole set of efficiency issues that we need to deal with. I mean, any ranking you look at, and just look at the World Bank ranking for port efficiency, right? We rank, last, right, out of all our ports. We're somewhere between the 330s and the 350s in the entire ranking system. I think we rank slightly better than Luanda, I think slightly better than some other port. So it requires for us to be able to ensure that we do this in tandem, right? So for example, you need to deal with, if you talk about the iron ore line, the Cape line, you're going to have to deal with issues around the tippler, for instance, and the efficiency in the port that has been hampering us to be able to get that done as quickly as possible. I'm fairly confident that the most recent announcement in Durban Container Terminal 2, which is the largest container terminal on the African continent, that the partnership and the strategic equity partnership with ICTS is going to be...
so that's the Philippines company?
That's the Philippines company, yeah. And that's the announcement that has recently been made by the board and the GCE, the newly appointed GCE, that they have now done the due diligence and they're quite satisfied that the ICTS meets all the requirements. What's needed right now is putting the money on the table and say, here's what we've agreed to pay you.
So the Philippines company is going to own 49% of the Pier 2 harbor system, right?
That's correct, yeah.
And government will own 51%, and then the Philippines company is going to be investing like a lot of money to upgrade.
Absolutely.
On a 25-year contract.
That's correct.
So when does this start?
Well, as I understand, I think they are busy finalizing those final arrangements. I'm not privy to that, but I suspect that should happen quite soon. I think there are two pluses for this, well, probably three. The first is that someone meets the kind of dire requirements for infrastructure investment in the port space, and in that port in particular, since it is one of the busiest ports. I think that's going to be the first thing. The second thing, it gives you access to global markets, right? So ICTS, being the fifth largest, player within the market space, despite it being the fifth, still has access to a whole set of different markets, including access to port equipment that is in dire need. And I think that's going to be quite important for us going forward. And the ability for us to be able to conclude such an arrangement, because this is selling of part of the port operation, not the infrastructure, part of the port operation, and having a strategic partner of this sense, I think it's going to be important. The second one, of course, is that you of course know that there were supposed to be two right? DCT2 and then Kuga. So hopefully once this transaction is complete, we're able to put out another call for proposals to see the potential of getting a private sector partner for Kuga. And Kuga is quite important strategically, right? From a deep water port and being significantly much more larger if one looks and takes a long-term perspective. So that's going to be important. So your original question, you require both efficiency on the rail, and Jamie will tell you the state of the rail infrastructure better than what I do. It's in dire need of massive, massive investments. We need to deal with theft and cable theft on the North Corridor line and the Northeastern Corridor line. We have to get security there. You need to deal with a whole set of infrastructure challenges that exist over there. But equally, we need to improve the efficiency of the port, or we simply don't get our stuff to market.
Okay, so James, you don't deal with Transnet as a client, so to speak, because you're not invested with Transnet, but you would have followed what Transnet's been up to and some of the reforms at Transnet, which now includes the permanent appointment of a CEO, etc. Obviously, if you invest in the railway system, you're going to be in partnership with Transnet. Are you comfortable with the reforms that are unfolding in Transnet?
Kevin, I think what you have to recognize with Transnet is that it's an organization with problems that are going to take a long time to solve. And those problems have been developed over more than a decade. And the primary issue that we can see in Transnet is that of maintenance. It's just maintenance. If you go back to 2012, Transnet spent in their freight rail division 3.4 billion rand on maintenance. If you go to 2013, they spent, if memory serves me right, 1.3 billion rand on maintenance, so a massive drop of approximately 2/3 in maintenance expenditure, and it never recovered. If you add up the underspend on maintenance from 2013 until 2023, there's an underspend of 30 billion rand on maintenance, okay? And infrastructure, of course, does not collapse like a landing aeroplane. It's fine for a long time, and then it collapses very quick. So to expect a new leadership of Transnet to arrive and to solve everything within 6 months is really a very, very big ask. We need to say, how are we going to bring Transnet back to an organization, and are we going to look at the railways of South Africa as the most important thing, okay? Because remember, we in the infrastructure game are not the economy. We only exist because there's an upstream economy. We serve the upstream economy, okay? So the most important thing is that the infrastructure is there to enable the upstream economy. So how do we as a nation make the right decisions about what's best for the upstream economy? Because that's where you employ 16 million people. In Transnet, you employ 34,000 people, okay? We need to make decisions as to what's best for the broader economy. And there are some very important, if you look at the freight logistics roadmap, for example, they say some very important things. For example, our national network is way too big. Most of our national network was built before the 1930s. We have about Transnet alone have about 23,000 route kilometers. About 85% of Africa's rail track is in South Africa. If you include PRASA and all of the ancillary lines in South Africa, you get to a total installed base of about 36,000 kilometers. That's bigger than Germany's installed rail network. That network is suffocating Transnet as it stands today. The freight logistics roadmap talks about the reduction in the size of our network. We move something like 1% of our freight volumes on 35% of the network.
Wow.
Okay? So the process should be implemented as it's planned on the freight logistics roadmap to reduce the size of the network, to enable Transnet to reduce and focus its maintenance spend back into areas where it can be really productive. Those are very important reforms that have to be implemented. The reintroduction of a network operating system. At the moment we're operating the network, and it says so in those documents, even according to spreadsheets, to bring back multi-rail, which is a globally respected integrated planning system and operating system across this complex network that operates like this, is very important to get away from the spreadsheets. Those are important. but it's a big job, Kevin.
Okay, so I accept that it's a big job, and I accept that there's massive reform, and I accept that there's been this massive neglect of maintenance, and therefore the system has decayed. So on the let's say on the 1st of April, we get the shiny new network statement. You look at the statement and you think, okay, this looks interesting. I'm an investor. From that point to when we see some benefit on the rail system, how long? How much time are we talking about? Given all of we've got problems with signals, we've got problems with maintenance, you've got to get the capital invested. How much time are we talking about?
So just in trains, okay, and that's in the investment into locomotives and wagons. From the time that you pay your deposit to one of the big international OEMs to come and assemble the locomotives in South Africa, which is more than likely what they will do, it's 24 months. You
24
might get
months.
some token delivery of a couple of locomotives.
To get your locomotives, this is not Chinese locomotives.
Not by traction, no.
No.
That'll be, so you'll get a token deliveries within 18 months. You'll have a couple of flags flying and a couple of champagne bottles popping. But for trains to arrive and of any consequence into South Africa, it's going to take 24 months. And remember that we've had a reform explosion in the region. Okay, the rail reform we're looking to implement into South Africa in the last 6 years has been implemented in almost every single one of our regional trading partners. So every available private train has been deployed outside of South Africa. I'm not aware of any trains in the private sector today to provide to South Africa tomorrow.
But
So it's an
Transnet
investment.
has some spare trains lying around.
They don't, Kevin. They have some very older generation locomotives that have been standing for a very, very long time. Okay?
Costs equally as much to refurbish them as it would be to buy new ones. That's the other problem that you sit with.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So it's an investment program that we're going to see into South Africa. But in the world of infrastructure, Kevin, 2 years marches by extremely fast. We aren't building businesses, and our mining houses and industrial businesses are not building businesses only for this year's year-end performance. We're building businesses for generations and for the future. So when it comes to a decision as to whether you close a mine because of rail capacity or keep it open, if you've got the option now of trains coming in future, I believe it'll change some decisions.
Okay, so let me ask you a tricky question or an unfair question. On a scale of 0 to 10, how confident are you that during the course of this year you will embark on investment in South African railway? 0 being there's no chance, 10 being 100% guaranteed.
I'm extremely confident, and I say that because if you look at what government has rolled out in the last 3 years in terms of reform, we've got the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, the National Rail Policy, the private sector participation framework for rail, economic regulation of transport bill, and the freight logistics roadmap, and the terms and conditions of Transnet's guarantee that has just been released by National Treasury. All of them say the same thing. All of them say we want to see private sector investment into trains actually happening. If every single one of those documents says it must happen, if we've got 6% of GDP that we lost in 2022, and we've got 4.5% of GDP lost in 2023, there's also an enormously big economic incentive for it to happen. It's not just government saying it, it has to happen. I believe that we are looking at a very high probability of the first business cases being announced this year.
Okay, so let me...
You forgot to mention one most important thing that we love doing is setting up crisis committees.
Yes.
Right? So we set up
one acronym I forgot.
So we set up a National Logistics Crisis Committee to facilitate. Well, I think it's quite important, and this National Crisis Committee, of course, is very different to simply being government-driven and government-owned and participation. What we have is some of the key private sector experts participating within this crisis committee.
That's right, yeah.
Its first and key responsibility is to try and ensure that we deal with performance on the rail sector, particularly dealing with the 5 corridors that we've identified, which are the most important corridors to take, to try and see whether we can get a turnaround as quickly as possible. There are other work streams, but I thought it's important. We love our
Another crisis committee.
Yes, absolutely.
It's terrible when you resolve the crisis, because then you've got to get rid of the committee, hey?
Kevin, that's my job. My job is to work myself out of a job, right?
Okay,
So that's
okay.
quite important.
Right, so let me ask you an unfair question, Rudy. We've got an election on the 29th of May. This reform process has been underway now for a couple of years. From my personal perspective, you and your team has done an excellent job, and you've done a good job in communicating those reforms. And every time I look at those reforms, I'm impressed with the progress. But I think you would admit that we're at a critical juncture now, right? And that juncture is we don't need anything that derails the reform process. Could the election do that? To what extent do you think that your initiative is irrespective of politics?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an unfair question you throw out. But let me try and answer it in the best possible way as a good bureaucrat, right? As a good bureaucrat, and in the way that one deals with delivery of particular sets of interventions, you should not have elections bother you,
Yes.
right? Because you're professionalizing what you needed to do, right? And I certainly see that. So from a point of view, I should say to myself, I don't really care who comes into power. What's important is for us to be able to continue this reform, because arguably the reform program since we've started this has had some significant impact, and has set us.
And you have the direct backing of the president in this reform process,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely, and I think that's quite important, Kevin, that the president himself has taken responsibility for this reform program. He drives it, we support him, he intervenes when it's required, we escalate it to him even. He writes letters, sometimes a bit nasty letters to ministers, but these are all part of him taking overall political responsibility for it and supporting the program. So I think it's quite important that what you want to do is, irrespective of what happens on the 29th of May, you want to see a continuation of the reform program. The risk is always there, right? There's always political risk, and you need to manage this. But certainly from where I sit, we want to see this continuing. And of course, if the current president continues, I think that what we will see is much faster, much poignant, and much more significant reforms moving at greater speed and getting it done as quickly as possible. And I think that's what I'm confident about. And hopefully we get to the 29th and past the 29th as quickly as possible.
And nothing changed. Okay.
Yeah.
You've got 30 seconds, Rudy. Are you convinced that the President of South Africa supports private sector involvement in the development of South African infrastructure?
Oh, absolutely. He understands the role. Your introduction early on where you say that government knows that it's run out of money. The conversations that we're having is, how do we get our infrastructure budgets funded, given that we see failing infrastructure all over? And the debate that we have currently right now, driven by the president, is how do we get the private sector involved in some of these infrastructure investments, whether it's rail, logistics, energy, water, distribution, electricity distribution, with its other forms of services that we can infrastructure services that are going to be quite critical. And that's really the president's view and thinking about it, that we have to see the private sector play a much more integral role. It has to step up. We have to create the correct environment. We have to provide the correct signals. We have to ensure that we create the regulatory mechanisms for them to be able to participate within the economy. And that's certainly what the reform program is about, and what we're going to see in the not-so-distant future as well.
Brilliant. We certainly have a vested interest at Stanlib in the investment, so I certainly hope that that all continues on. Time's up. Thanks a lot, guys. I think that was very valuable. Thanks for your contribution. Thanks for attending. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.